Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today we're really going deep. We're diving into the world of Vladimir Putin.
Oh, yeah. He is a fascinating figure.
He is. I mean, and I know that, most of our listeners probably already have some thoughts about Putin, right? I mean, he's been a major player on the world stage for decades now.
Decades, yeah.
But in this deep dive, we're going to go beyond just the headlines. We're going to really try to understand Putin, the man, his motivations and his impact, on Russia, on the world, the whole thing.
It's a wild story, really full of intrigue and ambition and just power plays. It's like a real-life political thriller.
Yeah, it is.
With twists and turns that would make even, the most seasoned spy novelist envious.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of spies,
yeah.
One of those interesting parts of Putin's story has got to be his background in the KGB.
Yeah, definitely.
16 years he spent there, from 1975 to 1991. Which is basically his entire adult life before he entered politics.
Right.
I know that's a pretty well-known fact, right? But I think it's worth digging a little deeper into.
I agree.
Because it wasn't just a job for Putin.
No.
It was a formative experience that really shaped his entire worldview, his understanding of power, and even just his approach to leadership.
Yeah, it's kind of like trying to understand an artist without looking at their early sketches.
Right.
If you want to really grasp Putin, we need to understand those KGB years.
Okay, so what do we actually know about his time in the KGB? Beyond the fact that he was there, what was his role? Where was he stationed? What did he actually do?
Well, we know that he started out in the counterintelligence division in Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg, of course.
Right.
And then he was posted to Dresden, East Germany in 1985. And that's where he worked as a liaison officer with the East German secret police, the Stasi.
Wow.
And that was during a period of immense change and upheaval in the entire Soviet bloc. The Berlin Wall came down just a few years later.
That's incredible. I mean, imagine being stationed there as a KGB officer, right? Witnessing the collapse of the communist system that you were sworn to uphold.
Right.
I mean, how do you think that experience might have affected Putin?
Well, I think it's pretty safe to say that it had a profound impact on him. Some historians and biographers even argue that witnessing the fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union instilled in Putin this deep sense of resentment towards the West.
Resentment?
Yeah, they believe that he saw it as a betrayal, a humiliation for Russia, and a sign of weakness.
Wow.
That he was absolutely determined to rectify.
So he goes from being a KGB officer in this crumbling communist state to becoming the president of Russia.
Right.
A country that's grappling with this new identity in a post-Soviet world. It's a complete 180.
Exactly. And I think understanding that transition, that shift in mindset is really crucial to understanding Putin's motivations and his actions as a leader today, because he brought that KGB mentality to the Kremlin.
A KGB mentality.
A focus on control, on secrecy, and a willingness to use whatever means necessary to achieve his goals.
So in a way, his KGB experience became a blueprint for how he would actually rule Russia.
I wouldn't say blueprint, but it definitely provided him with a set of tools and a way of thinking that he applied to his presidency.
I see.
The KGB was all about gathering intelligence, manipulating information, and maintaining control.
Yeah.
And those are elements that we've seen in Putin's leadership, from his very tight grip on the media to his crackdown on political dissent.
So those skills that he honed in the KGB were repurposed for a new mission.
Yeah.
Consolidating power and rebuilding Russia.
Precisely.
Right.
And that's what makes Putin such a complex and compelling figure. He's a product of his past, shaped by those experiences in the KGB and by the tumultuous events that unfolded, during his time there. Okay,
so we've established that Putin's KGB background had this major influence on his worldview and his style of leadership.
For sure.
But how did he actually rise to power? I mean, it's a pretty remarkable journey to go from, a mid-level KGB officer to the president of Russia.
It really is. It's a story that involves a lot of political maneuvering and some lucky breaks, you could even say, and ruthlessness.
Yeah.
Remember, this was Russia in the 1990s, right?
Right.
A period of chaos, uncertainty after that collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
It was a time when a lot of former KGB officers, with their experience in navigating complex power structures and their connections, within the security services, were able to kind of leverage those assets to gain influence.
So the fall of communism actually created an opportunity for someone like Putin.
In a way, yes. It created this power vacuum that he was, perfectly positioned to fill.
Right.
He was a skilled operator. He knew how to work the system, how to build alliances, and how to eliminate rivals.
Yeah.
And these were all valuable skills in the cutthroat world of Russian politics in the 1990s.
So how did he make his move? How did he go from former KGB officer to a major player on the political stage?
Well, after leaving the KGB in 1991, he returned to St. Petersburg and began working for the city government.
Okay.
And he quickly rose through the ranks, demonstrating his political acumen and his ability to get things done. And this caught the attention of some powerful figures in Moscow who saw him as a potential asset. And so in 1996, he was brought to Moscow to work in the presidential administration under Boris Yeltsin.
So he was plucked from obscurity and brought into the inner circle of power.
Yeah, basically. And once he was in Moscow, he didn't waste any time.
Right.
He was shrewd, he was ambitious and ruthlessly efficient. He gained Yeltsin's trust very quickly and was appointed head of the FSB in 1998.
The successor to the KGB.
Exactly.
So he was basically put in charge of the very organization he had served in for 16 years.
Yes. Which is incredible when you think about it. I mean, it just shows how much trust Yeltsin had in him and how much power Putin had already accumulated in such a short amount of time.
Wow.
And it was from that position of power, as the head of the FSB, that he would launch his bid for the presidency.
Okay, so we've talked about Putin's KGB background and his initial foray into politics.
Uh-huh.
But I'm curious, what was Russia like during this time? You mentioned it was a very chaotic period after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Can you paint a picture of what life was like for just ordinary Russians?
Yeah, imagine a country that had undergone a complete upheaval, both politically and economically.
Yeah.
All the old certainties were just gone, replaced by, confusion and insecurity. The planned economy had collapsed, leading to widespread unemployment and poverty.
Right.
The social safety net that had existed under communism was unraveling. Organized crime was rampant, and there was this deep yearning for stability, for a strong leader who could just restore order and bring back a sense of national pride.
So it sounds like Russia was ripe for a leader who could project strength and just offer a vision for the future.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what Putin did.
Right.
He stepped onto the political stage at a moment when Russia was just desperate for a savior, someone who could restore its lost greatness.
Right.
He offered this very compelling narrative, a return to stability, a crackdown on corruption, and this resurgence of Russian power on the world stage.
And that message clearly resonated with the Russian people. I mean, he rose to power incredibly quickly.
He did, and part of his success was due to his just masterful use of propaganda and his control of the media.
Right.
He understood the power of image, and he very carefully cultivated this persona that appealed to the Russian people.
Okay.
The tough, decisive leader, the former KGB agent, who could protect them from their enemies.
Both foreign and domestic.
Exactly.
It's so fascinating how he was able to leverage his KGB background to his advantage.
Right.
It's like he was playing a role, but a role he was just perfectly suited for.
He played it well, and in 1999, when Yeltsin suddenly resigned, Putin was prime minister at the time. He became acting president, and he very quickly consolidated his power, called for early elections, which he won handily.
Right.
Officially became president of Russia in 2000.
And the rest, as they say, is history.
Yeah.
He's been in power ever since, either as president or as prime minister, for over 2 decades.
It's incredible.
And he's managed to maintain this grip on power despite facing various challenges and controversies.
A testament to his political skill, his ruthlessness, his ability to adapt to changing circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, he is a master strategist.
Yeah.
A chess player who always seems to be a few moves ahead of his opponents.
For sure.
So we've talked about Putin's rise to power, his KGB background, and, that chaotic state of Russia in the 1990s that allowed him to kind of seize the moment. But what was his vision for Russia once he became president? What were his goals? How did he want to transform the country?
Well, I think it's important to understand that Putin's vision for Russia was very deeply rooted in his own personal experiences and his worldview. He saw the collapse of the Soviet Union as this tragedy, a humiliation for Russia,
Right.
a loss of its rightful place as a global superpower.
So he wanted to make Russia great again.
In a sense, yes, but it wasn't just about restoring Russia's former glory. It was about creating this new Russia, a strong and stable and prosperous nation that could stand up to the West and assert its influence on the world stage.
Okay. And how did he go about achieving that vision? What were some of his key policies and actions?
Well, one of his first priorities was to restore order and stability.
Okay.
So he cracked down on organized crime, reined in the oligarchs who had gained immense wealth and power during the Yeltsin era,
Right.
and just centralized control of the government. He also launched a series of reforms aimed at boosting the economy, which had been in a state of freefall since the collapse of the Soviet Union.
And were those reforms successful?
To a certain extent, yes.
Okay.
Russia experienced significant economic growth in the early 2000s, fueled in part by rising oil prices.
Okay.
Living standards improved for many Russians. Putin's popularity soared. He was seen as the man who had brought Russia back from the brink of collapse,
Right.
put it on the path to prosperity.
But wasn't that economic growth largely dependent on, external factors like the global demand for oil? What about the underlying structural problems in the Russian economy?
That's a good point. Putin's critics argue that he didn't do enough to diversify the Russian economy or to really address those underlying issues of corruption and cronyism.
Right.
They claim that he simply benefited from the global commodities boom
Right.
and that his economic policies were ultimately unsustainable.
So it was more about luck than good management.
It's a matter of debate. I mean, there's no doubt that Putin was fortunate to come to power at a time when oil prices were rising.
Right.
But he also made some, shrewd decisions that helped to stabilize the economy and attract foreign investment.
Okay.
He implemented a flat tax, he simplified the tax code, and created a more favorable business environment. These reforms, combined with the oil windfall, did lead to a period of sustained economic growth.
Okay, so there's more to the story than just rising oil prices.
Right.
But what about his other goals? You mentioned that he wanted to restore Russia's global standing, assert its influence on the world stage. How did he go about doing that?
Well, one way he did that was by projecting military power. He launched a major modernization program for the Russian armed forces, increased military spending, and just demonstrated a willingness to use force to achieve his foreign policy objectives.
Okay.
And this was a very clear departure from the Yeltsin era,
Yeah.
when Russia's military was in a state of disarray and its influence on the world stage had waned considerably.
Right.
He was sending a message,
What message?
that Russia was back and it was a force to be reckoned with.
And that message was received loud and clear by the international community.
It was.
But that assertive foreign policy also led to increased tensions with the West, right?
Yes, it did. Putin's actions in places like Georgia, Ukraine, and Syria, as well as his meddling in Western elections and his support for authoritarian regimes around the world, have really put him on a collision course with the United States and its allies.
It seems like Putin's vision for a strong and assertive Russia has come at the cost of alienating the West and increasing global tensions.
That's a fair assessment.
Okay.
But from Putin's perspective, he's simply defending Russia's interests and restoring its rightful place in the world. He sees the West as a threat, an enemy that is trying to weaken and contain Russia.
So we've covered Putin's KGB background, his rise to power, his economic reforms, and his very assertive foreign policy. It's a pretty complex picture with both positive and negative aspects. But we still haven't really talked about his domestic policies.
Right.
What kind of leader is he at home?
That's a crucial part of the story, and it's where we start to see the darker side of Putin's rule. While he's been praised for bringing stability and economic growth to Russia, he's also been criticized for his authoritarian tendencies. His crackdown on dissent, his suppression of civil liberties.
So a bit of a mixed bag.
Yeah.
He's brought stability and economic growth, but at the cost of freedom and democracy.
That's a common refrain among Putin's critics. They argue that he's created a system where he has almost absolute power, where opposition is ruthlessly crushed and where the media is tightly controlled. They point to the imprisonment of political opponents, the harassment of journalists and activists, and the restrictions on freedom of speech and assembly as just evidence of his authoritarianism.
That's a pretty damning indictment. But what about his supporters? What do they say in his defense?
His supporters argue that he's brought order to a chaotic country,
Right.
that he's restored national pride, and that he's standing up to the West, which they see as a threat to Russia's sovereignty. They often point to the chaos and instability of the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union as a justification for his strongman tactics.
So it's a classic case of the ends justifying the means.
In a way, yes, but it's a complex issue with no easy answers. Yeah, it really is. And Putin's approach to domestic politics, it's very much in line with his KGB background.
Right.
He sees the world through this lens of threat and control. And he's not afraid to use the tools of the state to suppress dissent and just maintain that grip on power.
So we're seeing those KGB tactics play out on the domestic front as well.
Yeah.
It's like he's running Russia as one giant intelligence operation with himself as the ultimate spy master.
That's a pretty striking analogy, but yeah, it does capture, I think, a certain aspect of his leadership style. He's all about control managing information, keeping his opponents off balance.
Yeah.
And he's shown himself to be quite adept at using the levers of power to achieve those ends.
Let's talk about some specific examples of that control over information and dissent. You mentioned the imprisonment of political opponents.
Yeah.
Can you give us a little more insight into that?
Absolutely. One of the most high-profile cases is that of Alexei Navalny.
Right.
He is a prominent opposition leader and anti-corruption activist who has been a thorn in Putin's side for years.
Well,
Navalny has been repeatedly harassed, and targeted with what appear to be politically motivated prosecutions. And in 2020, he was actually poisoned with a nerve agent, an attack that many believe was orchestrated by the Russian government.
that's chilling. And what about the media? I mean, how much control does Putin actually have over what Russians see and hear?
Well, the Russian media landscape has changed dramatically under Putin's rule.
I imagine.
Independent media outlets have been squeezed out, critical journalists have been silenced,
Wow.
and state-controlled television channels just pump out a steady stream of pro-government propaganda.
So it's becoming increasingly difficult for Russians to actually get objective information about what's happening in their own country.
Yeah, I think that's the concern. The Kremlin has become very adept at controlling the narrative,
Right.
shaping public opinion through this combination of censorship and propaganda and intimidation.
It sounds like Putin's been very effective at consolidating his power, silencing dissent. But how do the Russian people feel about all this? Are they okay with this level of control?
That's a complex question. Putin's approval ratings have remained consistently high throughout his entire rule, often hovering around 70% or higher. He's seen by many Russians, as you know, a strong leader who has brought stability and prosperity to the country. They credit him with restoring national pride after the humiliation of the Soviet collapse.
Right.
And for standing up to the West.
So he's a very popular leader despite these authoritarian tendencies.
Yes, and I think there are a few factors that contribute to his popularity.
Like what?
Well, one is the control of the media that we've already talked about.
Right.
You know, if people are only getting one side of the story, it's pretty easy to manipulate public opinion.
That's true.
Another factor is the relative economic stability that Russia has enjoyed under Putin. After the chaos and the economic turmoil of the 1990s, many Russians are just grateful for the period of stability and relative prosperity that they have now. They may not agree with all of Putin's policies, but they're willing to overlook his authoritarian tendencies as long as the economy is doing well and their lives are improving.
It's like the old saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Right.
But what about the Russians who do oppose Putin? How do they make their voices heard in a system that seems so rigged against them?
It's incredibly difficult. Opposition figures face constant harassment, intimidation, the threat of imprisonment. Independent media outlets are struggling to survive. Protests are quickly broken up by police. The space for dissent is shrinking rapidly.
So it's a very risky proposition to speak out against Putin?
It is, and that's by design. Putin has created a system where the costs of dissent are so high that most people simply choose to stay silent.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Putin's KGB background, his rise to power, his economic reforms, his assertive foreign policy, and his crackdown on dissent at home. It's a pretty complex and often disturbing picture, but I think it's important to maybe step back for a moment and just ask, what does all of this mean for the future of Russia? Where is Putin taking the country?
That is the million-dollar question, and it's a question that has analysts and policymakers around the world scratching their heads. Putin has really shown himself to be this master strategist, you know, a cunning tactician who's always several steps ahead of his opponents. But where is he ultimately leading Russia?
Yeah, is he trying to rebuild the Soviet Empire? Is he trying to create a new Cold War with the West?
It's really hard to say for sure. Some experts believe that Putin is driven by this nostalgia for the Soviet era, that he wants to restore Russia's lost greatness and reclaim its former sphere of influence. Others argue that he's simply a pragmatist, a ruthless opportunist who's willing to use whatever means necessary to just advance Russia's interests and secure his own grip on power.
So there's no clear consensus on his ultimate goals.
No, not really. And that's what makes him such a dangerous adversary. When you're dealing with someone whose motives are unclear, it's very difficult to predict their actions or to deter them from pursuing their goals.
Okay, but surely there are some clues, right? Some patterns in his behavior that we can maybe analyze to try to understand where he's taking Russia.
Absolutely. And one of the most revealing clues is his foreign policy. Over the past 2 decades, Putin has shown this willingness to use military force to achieve his objectives. From the invasion of Georgia in 2008 to the annexation of Crimea in 2014 to the intervention in Syria in 2015.
Yeah, and those actions suggest that he's definitely willing to take risks to use force to expand Russia's sphere of influence.
Exactly. And those actions have also led to a very sharp deterioration in relations with the West. The sanctions imposed on Russia after the annexation of Crimea have had a significant impact on the Russian economy, but they haven't deterred Putin from pursuing his goals.
So he's willing to accept economic pain in order to achieve his geopolitical objectives.
It seems so. And that's a worrying sign. It suggests that he's playing a long game, that he's willing to endure short-term pain in order to achieve those long-term gains.
And what about his domestic policies? Do they offer any clues about his vision for Russia?
I think they do. His crackdown on dissent, his control of the media, and his consolidation of power all kind of point to a desire to create this highly centralized and authoritarian state. He seems to be building a system where he has almost absolute control, where opposition is ruthlessly crushed and where the people are just expected to follow his lead without question.
So he's not really interested in democracy or a pluralistic society.
It doesn't seem that way. His actions suggest that he sees those things as weaknesses, as threats to his power and to the stability of the state. He seems to believe that Russia needs a strong leader, a firm hand to guide it through turbulent times.
But that kind of thinking can be very dangerous. Right, can lead to tyranny, to the suppression of individual rights and freedoms.
It can, and that's the concern that many people have about Putin's Russia.
Yeah.
They see a country that is sliding back into authoritarianism,
right.
A country where the rule of law is being eroded, where the media is controlled by the state, and where dissent is ruthlessly crushed.
It's a chilling thought. But what can be done about it? I mean, is there any way to stop Putin's slide into authoritarianism?
That's a difficult question. The West has tried to use sanctions and diplomatic pressure to influence Putin's behavior.
Right.
But those efforts have had limited success. Putin seems determined to pursue his own course regardless of the consequences.
So we're just supposed to sit back and watch as he turns Russia into an authoritarian state?
I don't think so. I think it's important to continue to speak out against human rights abuses, to support independent media and civil society in Russia, and to hold Putin accountable for his actions.
But can those efforts really make a difference?
Yeah.
I mean, Putin seems so entrenched in power, so determined to silence his critics.
It's a long shot for sure, but I think it's important to try. We can't just stand by and watch as Russia descends into tyranny. We have a moral obligation to speak out against injustice and to support those who are fighting for freedom and democracy.
I agree. And speaking of fighting for freedom and democracy, let's talk about one of the most significant events in Putin's rule. The annexation of Crimea in 2014.
Yeah, that was a pivotal moment, a turning point, I think, in Putin's presidency and in Russia's relationship with the West.
Can you give us some background on Crimea and why it was so important to Putin?
Sure. Crimea is a peninsula in the Black Sea that has a long and complex history.
Yeah.
It was part of the Russian Empire for centuries before being transferred to Soviet Ukraine in 1954. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Crimea remained part of Ukraine, but it had a large Russian population and was actually home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet.
So it was a strategically important territory with these deep historical and cultural ties to Russia.
Exactly, and Putin saw the opportunity to seize Crimea in 2014 when Ukraine was in a state of political turmoil following the ouster of pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych.
And he moved quickly, sending in Russian troops to take control of the peninsula.
He did, and the West was really caught off guard. They condemned the annexation as this violation of international law, but they were very reluctant to take any concrete action to reverse it.
And what was the reaction in Russia?
Well, the annexation of Crimea was wildly popular in Russia. Putin's approval rating soared, and he was hailed as a national hero for restoring Crimea to the Russian motherland.
So it was a huge political victory for Putin.
It was. It solidified his grip on power, boosted his popularity, and sent a very clear message to the West that Russia was back on the world stage and willing to use force to achieve its goals.
But it also came at a price, right? I mean, the annexation of Crimea led to international sanctions, further isolated Russia from the West, and it kind of set the stage for this ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine.
Yes, it did. The annexation of Crimea was a gamble, and it's one that Putin seems willing to double down on.
Yeah, it's a high-stakes game he's playing, that's for sure. And it has far-reaching implications, not just for Russia, but for the entire world.
Yep.
But speaking of high-stakes games, I think it's time to shift our focus to something that has been a real hallmark of Putin's rule, his mastery of power politics.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, his ability to consolidate power, outmaneuver his opponents, and maintain control for over 2 decades is truly remarkable. He's like a grandmaster,
A grandmaster.
playing a game of multidimensional chess, always thinking several moves ahead.
Okay, so what are some of his key strategies he's used to stay in power for so long?
Right?
I mean, he's been in power longer than many of our listeners have been alive.
It's true. Longer than some countries have been independent. And it's really due to a combination of factors. One is his control of the media and his ability to really shape public opinion. We've already talked about that a bit, but,
Right.
It's worth reiterating just how effective he's been at controlling that narrative and creating this cult of personality around himself.
Right? It's like he's created this echo chamber where dissenting voices are just drowned out by a chorus of, praise and adulation.
Exactly, and that makes it incredibly difficult for any opposition to gain any traction. But it's not just about controlling the media.
Right.
Putin is also a master of manipulating the entire political system to his advantage.
Okay.
He's changed the Constitution to extend his own term limits, he's cracked down on opposition parties, and he's appointed loyalists to these key positions throughout the government.
So he's basically rigged the system in his favor.
I mean, you could say that, yeah, he's created a system where it's almost impossible to challenge him from within.
Wow.
And for those who do dare to challenge him, the consequences can be severe. We talked about the case of Alexei Navalny.
Right.
But there are countless other examples of opposition figures who've been harassed, intimidated, imprisoned, or even killed under very mysterious circumstances.
It's a very effective, if ruthless, way of maintaining power.
It is, and it's one of the reasons why Putin has been so successful at staying in power for so long. But it's also a system that is inherently unstable.
Okay.
When you suppress all dissent, when you create a system where there are no checks and balances, you create the conditions for instability and upheaval.
So his very success at consolidating power could actually sow the seeds of his own downfall.
It's possible, and I think that's something that Putin himself is aware of. He's a very shrewd and calculating leader, and he knows that his hold on power is not absolute. That's why he's so obsessed with control, why he's so ruthless in crushing any opposition.
Like he's constantly looking over his shoulder, paranoid that someone's going to try to, take his power away from him.
Exactly, and that paranoia really drives a lot of his behavior, both domestically and internationally. It explains his crackdown on dissent at home, his assertive foreign policy, and his willingness to use military force to just achieve his objectives. He sees threats everywhere, and he's just determined to stay one step ahead of them.
But that kind of paranoia, isn't that kind of unsustainable in the long run?
Right.
You can't live your life constantly looking over your shoulder waiting for the other shoe to drop.
No, it's not a sustainable way to live, and it's not a sustainable way to govern. But Putin seems to be trapped in this cycle of paranoia and control. He's created this system that's designed to protect his power.
Right.
But that system is also creating the conditions for its own demise.
So what does the future hold for Putin and for Russia? Is this current system sustainable? Can he maintain his grip on power indefinitely?
Those are the questions that everyone is asking, but no one seems to have any clear answers. Putin is a master of, playing his cards close to his chest.
Right.
He's very good at adapting to these changing circumstances. He's survived multiple crises, economic downturns, international pressure. But there are cracks starting to show, I think, in this facade.
What kind of cracks?
Well, the sanctions imposed by the West, after the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Ukraine, they have taken their toll on the Russian economy.
Yeah.
The standard of living for a lot of Russians has declined. And there's this growing discontent, I think, among the population.
So that economic pain is starting to be felt by ordinary Russians.
Yes, and that's something that Putin can't ignore indefinitely. He's built his popularity on the promise of stability and prosperity. If he can't deliver on those promises, his grip on power could start to weaken.
But he's also been very successful at cracking down on dissent, silencing his critics. Can't he just use those same tactics to quell any unrest?
He can try, but it's a risky strategy. The more he cracks down, the more he risks alienating the population and creating martyrs for the opposition. And as we've seen in other authoritarian regimes, once the genie of dissent is out of the bottle, it's very difficult to put it back in.
So it's a delicate balancing act for Putin.
Right.
He needs to maintain control, but he also needs to address these growing economic problems and social unrest. It's a tough spot to be in.
It is. And It's a situation that's likely to become even more challenging in the coming years as Russia faces a number of demographic, economic, and geopolitical headwinds.
Well, it certainly seems like we're entering this new chapter in the Putin saga. It'll be very interesting to see how he navigates these challenges and what the long-term implications will be for Russia and the world.
Indeed, the stakes are very high, and the outcome is far from certain.
Well, on that note of uncertainty, I think we'll have to wrap up our deep dive into the world of Vladimir Putin. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with a few final thoughts.
Sure.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from Putin's KGB background to his rise to power, his economic policies, his assertive foreign policy, and his crackdown on dissent. It's a complex and often contradictory story, one that really defies easy categorization or simple explanations.
Yeah, it's a story that is still being written, a story that will continue to unfold in the years to come.
And it's a story that we all need to pay attention to, because the decisions that Putin makes, the actions that he takes, will have a profound impact on the world for decades to come.
I couldn't agree more. Understanding Vladimir Putin is not just about understanding one man or one country. It's about understanding the forces that are shaping our world,
right?
The dynamics of power and conflict, and the challenges that we all face in a globalized and interconnected world.
That is a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Vladimir Putin. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.